Part 1, Chapter 2 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 1, Chapter 2. Exit a Man of the World. That a man of the world, so subject to the vicissitudes of fortune as Montague Dartie, should still be living in a house he had inhabited 20 years at least, would have been more noticeable if the rent, rate, taxes, and repairs of that house had not been defrayed by his father-in-law. By that simple, if wholesale device, James Forsyte had secured a certain stability in the lives of his daughter and his grandchildren. After all, there is something invaluable about a safe roof over the head of a sportsman so dashing as Dartie. Until the events of the last few days, he had been almost supernaturally steady all this year. The fact was, he had acquired a half share in a filly of George Forsyte's, who had gone irreparably on the turf, to the horror of Roger, now still by the grave. Sleevelinks, by Martyr, out of Shirt on Fire, by Suspender, was a bay filly, 3 years old, who for a variety of reasons had never shown her true form. With half ownership of this hopeful animal, all the idealism latent somewhere in Dartie, as in every other man, had put up its head, and kept him quietly ardent for months past. When a man has something good to live for, it is astonishing how sober he becomes, and what Dartie had was really good. A 3-to-1 chance for an autumn handicap, publicly assessed at 25-to-1. The old-fashioned heaven was a poor thing beside it, and his shirt was on the daughter of Shirt on Fire. But how much more than his shirt depended on this granddaughter of Suspender. At that roving age of 45, trying to Forsyte's, and though perhaps less distinguishable from any other age, trying even to Dartie's, Montague had fixed his current fancy on a dancer. It was no mean passion, but without money, and a good deal of it, likely to remain a love as airy as her skirts, and Dartie never had any money, subsisting miserably on what he could beg or borrow from Winifred, a woman of character, who kept him because he was the father of her children, and from a lingering admiration for those now dying Wardour Street good looks, which in their youth had fascinated her. She, together with any one else who would lend him anything, and his losses at cards and on the turf—extraordinary how some men make a good thing out of losses—were his whole means of subsistence, for James was now too old and nervous to approach, and Soames too formidably adamant. It is not too much to say that Dartie had been living on hope for months. He had never been fond of money for itself, had always despised the Forsytes with their investing habits, though careful to make such use of them as he could. What he liked about money was what it bought: personal sensation. "No real sportsman cares for money," he would say, borrowing a pony if it was no use trying for a monkey. There was something delicious about Montague Dartie. He was, as George Forsyte said, a daisy. The morning of the handicap dawned clear and bright, the last day of September, and Dartie, who had travelled to Newmarket the night before, arrayed himself in spotless checks and walked to an eminence to see his half of the filly take her final canter. If she won, he would be a cool 3 thou in pocket, a poor enough recompense for the sobriety and patience of these weeks of hope while they had been nursing her for this race. But he had not been able to afford more. Should he lay it off at the 8-to-1 which she had advanced? This was his single thought while the larks sang above him, and the grassy downs smelled sweet, and the pretty filly passed tossing her head and glowing like satin. After all, if he lost it, it would not be he who paid, and to lay it off would reduce his winnings to some 1500, hardly enough to purchase a dancer out and out. Even more potent was the itch in the blood of all the Darties for a real flutter. And turning to George, he said: "She's a clipper. She'll win hands down. I shall go the whole hog." George, who had laid off every penny, and a few besides, and stood to win however it came out, grinned down on him from his bulky height, with the words, "So ho, my wild one!" For after a checkered apprenticeship, weathered with the money of a deeply complaining Roger, his Forsyte blood was beginning to stand him in good stead in the profession of owner. There are moments of disillusionment in the lives of men from which the sensitive recorder shrinks. Suffice it to say that if the good thing fell down, sleeve links finished in the ruck, Dartie's shirt was lost. Between the passing of these things and the day when Soames turned his face towards Green Street, what had not happened? When a man with the constitution of Montague Dartie has exercised self-control for months from religious motives and remains unrewarded, he does not curse God and die. He curses God and lives, to the distress of his family. Winifred, a plucky woman, if a little too fashionable, who had borne the brunt of him for exactly 21 years, had never really believed that he would do what he did now. Like so many wives, she thought she knew the worst, but she had not yet known him in his 45th year, when he, like other men, felt that it was now or never. Paying on the 2nd of October a visit of inspection to her jewel case, she was horrified to observe that her woman's crown and glory was gone. The pearls which Montague had given her in '86 when Benedict was born, and which James had been compelled to pay for in the spring of '87 to save scandal. She consulted her husband at once. He pooh-poohed the matter. They would turn up. Nor till she said sharply, "Very well then, Monty, I shall go down to Scotland Yard myself," did he consent to take the matter in hand. Alas, that the steady and resolved continuity of design necessary to the accomplishment of sweeping operations should be liable to interruption by drink. That night Dartie returned home without a care in the world, or a particle of reticence. Under normal conditions Winifred would merely have locked her door and let him sleep it off, but torturing suspense about her pearls had caused her to wait up for him. Taking a small revolver from his pocket and holding on to the dining table, he told her at once that he did not care a curse whether she lived so long as she was quiet, but he himself was tired of life. Winifred, holding on to the other side of the dining table, answered, "Don't be a clown, Monty. Have you been to Scotland Yard?" Placing the revolver against his chest, Dartie had pulled the trigger several times. It was not loaded. Dropping it with an imprecation, he muttered, "For the sake of the children," and sank into a chair. Winifred, having picked up the revolver, gave him some soda water. The liquor had a magical effect. Life had deluged him. Winifred had never understood him. If he hadn't the right to take the pearls he had given her himself, who had? That Spanish filly had got 'em. If Winifred had any objection, he should cut her throat. What was the matter with that? Probably the first usage of that celebrated phrase, so obscure are the origins of even the most classical language. Winifred, who had learned self-containment in a hard school, looked up at him and said, "Spanish filly? Do you mean that girl we saw dancing in the Pandemonium Ballet? Well, you're a thief and a blackguard." It had been the last straw on a sorely loaded consciousness. Reaching up from his chair, Dartie seized his wife's arm, and, recalling the achievements of his boyhood, twisted it. Winifred endured the agony with tears in her eyes, but no murmur. Watching for a moment of weakness, she wrenched it free, then, placing the dining table between them, said between her teeth, "You are the limit, Monty." Undoubtedly the inception of that phrase, so is English formed under the stress of circumstances. Leaving Dartie with foam on his dark moustache, she went upstairs, and after locking her door and bathing her arm in hot water, lay awake all night, thinking of her pearls adorning the neck of another, and of the consideration her husband had presumably received therefor. The man of the world awoke with a sense of being lost to that world, and a dim recollection of having been called a "limit." He sat for half an hour in the dawn and the armchair where he had slept, perhaps the unhappiest half hour he had ever spent, For even to a Dartie there is something tragic about an end.